Madam President, dear colleagues, you never get used to abominations. This is how the French war photographer Christian Spengler put it a few years ago. We can, indeed we must, understand this sentence as an order. We must never get used to war resentment. With the founding of the European Union, this mission has largely become a reality for us Europeans. Therefore, the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine, the barbaric attack of Hamas on Israel, and, last but not least, the Iranian terrorist regime and its nuclear weapons program directed primarily against Israel seem to us to be from another time. But these events are now the new reality in the world in which we live. We need to take a look. We must learn from these crimes and challenges. We have to face them. We must draw the right conclusions from this new reality, because only in this way can we preserve freedom and peace, at least in Germany and in Europe. Because the geopolitical upheavals of the present, ladies and gentlemen, affect us in Germany not only indirectly. We are dealing with a new reality that directly affects and calls into question our freedom, our security, and our prosperity. And we, as the Federal Republic of Germany, are faced with the task of actively and directly representing our interests in this new reality and helping to shape the geopolitical environment in which we live to the best of our abilities. We have every opportunity to do so because we have entered into alliances over the past decades and have maintained them. Because we have strengthened the formats of European and international cooperation. Germany is not alone. We are a part and an actor in a dense network of partnerships and alliances. In this context, I am talking first and foremost about the European Union, but also about NATO and the G7. The fact that we have come together in all three formats for exceptionally important meetings within just 2 weeks is an expression of the great global challenges and, at the same time, an expression of the opportunities for Germany and for Europe to change the new reality for the better together with our partners. Based on these alliances, we, as the Federal Republic of Germany, can help shape how the world will develop in the coming years. But there is a double prerequisite for this. We need strength and reliability, both internally and externally at the same time. Dear colleagues, strength and reliability, these are exactly the objectives with which we, as the new German federal government, have set to work in recent weeks. Since then, we have shown that we are creative inside. We have launched an investment package for defense and infrastructure. We have set up an immediate program for the German economy in record time. We have initiated the migration turnaround. And we have shown our international partners that they can rely on us. Germany is back on the European and international stage. This new determination is registered in the world and is very welcomed by our partners and friends. Ladies and gentlemen, the G7 summit was a first welcome opportunity to exchange views on the big issues, about the state of the world economy, about commodity partnerships, about the wars in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, about migration, and finally about the resilience of our democracies. The meeting made it clear that we continue to stand together as the 7 major industrial nations of the world. There was consensus in this circle on all essential issues. The summit of the G7 this year was particularly marked by the current escalation of the conflict between Israel and Iran. The federal government's position on this is clear. Israel has a right to defend its existence and the safety of its citizens. Part of the state rationale of the Mullah regime has been the annihilation of the State of Israel for years. Our state rationale is the defense of the State of Israel in its existence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the difference, and I will continue to state this difference clearly and unambiguously at the word in the future. On the first day of the G7 summit, we agreed on a joint declaration to that effect. This was and is an extremely encouraging sign and signal of this summit. Without Iran, there would be 7. October 2023 was not possible in Israel. Hamas, Hezbollah, and Houthi rebels are the terrorist organizations financed and equipped by Iran. The Iranian government has been destabilizing the entire Middle East for decades. The dangerousness of the nuclear program was again pointed out by the independent International Atomic Energy Agency in an alarming report just a few days ago. For Germany and the international community of these organizations, therefore, remains a guide to action. Iran is not allowed to have nuclear weapons. On the other hand, only in recent days, the Iranian leadership has again announced itself that it will continue uranium enrichment beyond 60%. This announcement, dear colleagues, the deep bunkering of the centrifuges, the restriction of access for the representatives of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the constant deception of the public, show how serious Iran really was and obviously is with the nuclear weapons program.
Wie ernst es dem Iran mit dem Atomwaffenprogramm tatsächlich war und offensichtlich ist.
That's why I want to say it again from this point. Today, we hope that the actions of Israel and the United States of America in recent days will permanently prevent Iran from getting even closer to its destructive goal. Not only Israel, but also Europe and the world as a whole are threatened by this Iranian nuclear program. The conflict with Iran must not plunge the entire region into a war. That is why, as the federal government, we are also making every diplomatic effort to prevent exactly this with all our means. We therefore welcome the American president's call for a ceasefire. If this ceasefire succeeds, after the decisive military strikes by the US and the Israeli army against the Iranian nuclear facilities in Fordo, Nathans and Isfahan, then a very good development is possible that can make the Middle East and the world safer. We now call on both Iran and Israel to follow this call of the American president. We would like to thank Qatar and other states of the region for their prudence in the dramatic last days and hours. On the sidelines of today's NATO summit in The Hague, we will discuss with our American and European partners how the situation can now be further stabilized. By escalating the Iranian nuclear program, we are not losing sight of the bigger picture. we allow ourselves to critically inquire what goal Israel wants to achieve in the Gaza Strip. And we urge a humane treatment of the people in the Gaza Strip, especially with the women, the children, and the elderly.
Vor allem mit den Frauen, den Kindern und den Älteren.
And now, just today and in these days, the moment has also come to conclude a ceasefire for Gaza.
Für Gaza abzuschließen.
And in this connection, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to say a particularly heartfelt word of thanks to the Federal Foreign Minister for his intensive diplomatic efforts in recent days and weeks, together above all and time and again with the foreign ministers of France and the United Kingdom. Europe has it here in coordination with the United States of America. Europe has shown unity and diplomatic ability.
Europa in Abstimmung mit den Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika Geschlossenheit und diplomatische Fähigkeit gezeigt.
And I would also like to thank our foreign minister for his clear stance on the association agreement with Israel. A suspension or even a termination of this agreement is out of the question with the federal government.
Kommt mit der Bundesregierung nicht in Frage.
Ladies and gentlemen, the violent annexation of Crimea was the reason, in the year 2014, that Russia was excluded from the format of the G7. To this day, Putin shows every day with his war crimes in Ukraine that he is indifferent to common rules, and that in the slipstream of events in the Near and Middle East, and despite all diplomatic efforts in recent days, he has once again intensified the air raids on Ukrainian cities.
Die Luftangriffe auf ukrainische Städte noch einmal verschärft hat.
There is a consensus among the G7 that this war must end as soon as possible. Ukraine has agreed to an immediate ceasefire without any preconditions. Russia has refused to do so. And although we have tried everything with our international partners in recent weeks to bring Russia to the negotiating table, I would like to take this opportunity to say once again, also addressed to all those who repeatedly claim that the diplomatic means are not being exhausted in this matter. A real, lasting peace presupposes a readiness for peace from all times. Russia, on the other hand, with its new wave of attacks on the Ukrainian civilian population, has made it clear in a barbaric way that it does not currently have this readiness for peace. On the contrary, a few days ago, at a speech at the annual Economic Forum in St. Petersburg, the Russian president once again stated that Russians and Ukraine are one people, and literally, the whole of Ukraine belongs to us.
Die gesamte Ukraine gehört uns.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this situation, giving in to aggression and giving up one's own country is not the peacemaking solution. This is not the peace we want. And this is not the peace that Ukraine is seeing. Real peace work now means continuing the painstaking work on the conditions for real peace. And this is exactly what we are doing in the European Union, in close cooperation with the Ukrainians. Putin understands only the language of strength. And that is why peace work now also means speaking in this language. In this sign is the 18, a package of sanctions against Russia, which we want to launch at the upcoming European Council in Brussels. In particular, it will affect the shadow fleet with which Putin is currently financing his war machine, and which is increasingly aggressively wreaking havoc in the Baltic Sea, At the G7 summit and during my previous visit to Washington, I explicitly called for the US to once again strengthen its sanctions against Russia. That would promote the end of killing demanded by us President Donald Trump that we all strive for. I remain confident that the American government will also follow this path. Ladies and gentlemen, securing peace in Europe for the coming decades and for generations to come is what we are all about when we meet in The Hague this evening and tomorrow for the NATO summit. It is fair to call this summit historical without exaggeration. We will decide to invest significantly more in our security in the future. We are not doing this, as is occasionally claimed, to do the United States and its president a favor. We are doing this from our own point of view and conviction, because Russia in particular is actively and aggressively threatening the security and freedom of the entire Euro-Atlantic area, because we have to fear that Russia will continue the war beyond Ukraine. That's why we're doing this. We do this in the shared conviction that we must be so strong together that no one can dare to attack us. And that is why it is a historical situation in which we find ourselves. In this situation, Germany must also take responsibility, and we are doing that. We will do and take on a fair share of the alliance work. This means that we meet the capability goals that we agree on with our alliance partners. That is also why we changed our basic law here in the House a few months ago. We will make the Bundeswehr the strongest conventional army in Europe, as our partners rightly expect from us, given our size, our performance, our geographical location. We will directly support our allies on the eastern flank of NATO. With this in mind, the Federal Minister of Defense and I put the first units of the new Brigade 45 into service in Lithuania at the beginning of April, at the Constellation Appeal in Vilnius, and I will say it again from this point today, for far too long. We in Germany have not wanted to hear the warnings of our Baltic neighbors about Russia's imperialist policy. We have recognized this error. There is no way back from this realization. The security of Lithuania is also the security of Germany. I will travel on the NATO summit to the European Council in Brussels on Wednesday. On the one hand, we will talk with our European partners there about how we can jointly use the new means for defense, as quickly as possible and in the best possible and efficient way. However, the European strength and creative power also depends on our economic strength. And that's actually the good news for us, because with the European single market, we have a growth market with further great potential. This European internal market is our global insurance against shocks and against external uncertainty. A central task for us in Europe in the coming years will therefore be to further deepen this internal market and at the same time to promote an ambitious common European trade policy. And this, in addition to the common goal of a pan-European migration turnaround, will be the third central topic on which we are discussing in the European Council. How do we ensure the competitiveness of the European economy? Let me say this in principle right away. With this federal government, Germany is becoming a voice for a sustainable and competitive economy in Brussels. It is clear to us that we need progress in Europe on what is now known as the Savings and Investment Union. We need a more integrated energy infrastructure. But we also have, and we need, a comprehensive reduction of bureaucracy to free the economy and innovations from state shackles. I want to make it even clearer, we need much less regulation in Europe. With the presentation of its so-called omnibus packages, the European Commission has now taken a step towards simplifying and speeding up existing regulations and procedures. This is a first step that many more have to follow. That is what I will be advocating for at the European Council. But above all, I will insist that the legislation of the future is already marked by this change of mentality. We need a new culture of restraint when it comes to European regulation. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, this is also a prerequisite for us to be able to jointly pursue a successful trade policy, because we cannot expect the whole world to align itself with our complex and European standards and rules. It is a question of competitiveness that we should position ourselves even more broadly with regard to our trade partnerships. But it is also a key question of strategic resilience. It will be decisive for the future that we answer them well and that we answer them promptly. And that means, in plain language, to conclude as many new trade agreements as possible, and if possible, as pure trade agreements, that only require the approval of the European institutions, no longer in the grueling processes that have been going on for years, as unfortunately happens again and again in Germany in the national parliaments. Against this background, ladies and gentlemen, you know that the EU Commission is currently negotiating a solution to the customs conflict with the American government. The federal government is with all European partners. Customs duties benefit no one. They harm everyone. It is therefore in all of our interests that the trade conflict with the USA does not escalate further. I know that the European Commission is negotiating with great care in this regard, and it has our full support in this. I personally hope that we will come to a solution with the USA by the beginning of July. However, if this is not possible, we are also prepared for this, namely with a number of options. The EU can and will defend its interests. However, my impression from the talks with the American president is that the United States is also interested in further cooperation with us, with Europe, and, above all, with us in Germany on economic issues. Ladies and gentlemen, it is also our economic strength that first creates creative power and negotiating strength for us. It provides us first with the means we need, the security, also and especially the social security to finance, which makes our life in freedom possible. In this respect, it follows for responsible politics and follows for this federal government that ensuring the competitiveness of the German economy must be a priority. That is why the following applies to our federal government, to this federal government. We want Germany to remain a modern industrial country in which it is a pleasure for all people and generations to work. Therefore, we will now very quickly and consistently implement our immediate program, which we have already agreed in the Cabinet. We are on the way to reaching an agreement with the Prime Minister of the Länder on this. We will improve the framework conditions for private and state investments so that companies, in particular, invest more in Germany again. At the same time, we will solve the structural growth breaks that are inhibiting our country as quickly and ambitiously as possible. Above all, these are the excessively high energy prices and the bureaucratic burden. Our energy policy will follow the claim, affordable, safe, open to technology. And we are pointing out a fundamental change of mentality in regulation, including at the national level. We stop the culture of mistrust, which does nothing to help the black sheep, but only puts obstacles in the way of everyone else. Against this background, ladies and gentlemen, it is a very good sign that the economic forecasts for the German economy have recently been significantly revised upwards. However, it must now also continue in this direction. The next big priority for the federal government will be to ensure that people in Germany as a whole can once again experience that their efforts are paying off, that the principle of fair performance applies again. And in this sense, we are planning relief for employees. And in this sense, the Federal Ministry of Labor is working in the federal government to replace, for example, the citizens' allowance with a new basic security. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by saying that the past weeks have once again been weeks of crisis, of upheaval, even of violence in large parts of the world, in Ukraine, in Iran, in Israel, in Gaza.
Auch der Gewalt in der Ukraine, im Iran, in Israel, in Gaza.
The past few weeks have shown once again that we cannot expect that the world around us will soon return to quieter times permanently. But we can very well influence how this new normal looks in our everyday life. We can make sure that at least for us it goes hand in hand with freedom, with prosperity, and with peace. The entire federal government is devoting all its energy to this very goal. And in this regard, the past few weeks have even made me a little confident overall, because they have shown that we as a country are up to this task and we can cope with the problems on our own.
Und wir können die Probleme aus eigener Kraft heraus bewältigen.
The prerequisite for this is, and I want to emphasize this again in conclusion, that we are strong from the inside out, and from the outside, as a society that sticks together and knows what is at stake, and as a business location that enables investments, creates innovation, growth, and added value. I can promise on behalf of the German government that we will continue to work very hard in the coming weeks, months, and years to ensure that Germany regains its strength, both internally and externally. And it is precisely with this leitmotif that I will be representing Germany at the upcoming NATO summit in The Hague and at the European Council in Brussels. Thank you for your attention.